Well, good morning. My name is Sara Osborne, for those of you who don't know me, and I wear several hats here at the C of O, S of O community. I'm an adjunct instructor in the English department at the college. I teach composition and TESOL, and right now I'm actually teaching a course on the history and practice of classical education to some students who are interested in doing that with their futures, which is excellent. I've also classically homeschooled full-time for a couple of years. I write periodically for the Classical Thistle. I'm a mother to 3 S of O students who are being classically trained. And I'm also the mother to educational outliers on both ends of the spectrum, which is why I have an interest in what we're going to talk about today. I'm also simply passionate about learning, and from my own experiences as well as those of my children, I've come to ask a lot of questions about the educational system as it stands today, and not just about K-12 education in general, but even classical Christian K-12 education. I think there's still a lot of room for growth in that, and the resurgence is relatively new, and there's still some questions that need to be asked about how it can get better and improve, and specifically for those students who might be on the high end or the low end of our classrooms. So I think it's definitely something that needs our attention. So it comes as no surprise then that when an author and educator who I highly respect, Susan Wise Bauer, who many of you may be familiar with, many of you might use her Story of the World history curriculum. You might be familiar with her Ordinary Parent's Guide to Reading to teach phonics. You might have used her Writing with Ease for writing. She's even produced some anthologies for Norton. She was the author of The Well-Trained Mind that largely propelled the classical homeschooling movement resurgence. Or maybe that wasn't a resurgence since it was homeschooling, but anyway, you get the picture. So when she came out with a book that was asking many of the same questions that I've been asking, it certainly got my attention. Some of these questions are, why is my child struggling? Why is she bored? Why can't he do what other kids his age are doing? Why is the light going out inside of her? Why isn't the curriculum reaching him? Why doesn't she have friends? Is homeschooling the only option when your child simply doesn't fit? Is there something wrong with my child? Something wrong with the school? Are my expectations simply too high? These are a lot of the questions that I've been asking, and the title of Susan Wise Bauer's book kind of gives her position on the issue, and that is that it's time to rethink school as we know it. Parents and educators need to ask some key questions about why we do things the way that we do, even within the classical K-12 framework. So I thought I'd begin by just asking a question that may seem, you may not know where this is going, but just follow me here. Does anybody know why we have classrooms divided by age for grades in the K-12 system? You're not allowed to answer, Kyle. I'm just kidding. Why do we have that, Kyle?
It has to do with the Prussian army, I believe.
It does. And I'd like to enlighten you a little bit if you'll indulge me. I'd like to read you a few paragraphs from Susan Wise Bauer's new book. Before about 1850, teachers in American schools taught mixed age groups together in one room with no standard curriculum. Students just moved to more difficult material when they were ready at widely varying times. The medieval predecessor of the American one-room schoolhouse, the European cathedral school, might have had students from age 8 up to 21 or 22, all chanting the same lessons until they were learned. But over in Prussia, a new system had been instituted in the early 1800s, smaller classrooms where students were grouped by age and led by a single teacher. This strategy was not driven by educational research. It was an attempt to try to restore Prussian military might after a humiliating defeat by Napoleon. Struggling to rebuild, Prussian statesmen decided to organize schools like military units in order to instill the will to fight and build pride in Prussia's historically pugnacious national culture. Students were organized into platoons by age and assigned to a single squadron leader, a system that made the transition into military service quite straightforward. In 1843, Horace Mann, Secretary of Education for the state of Massachusetts, visited Prussia to tour its schools. At the time, no American state had anything like a unified education system. but all the states were dealing with a huge swell in immigration and the need to somehow assimilate these thousands of newcomers. Man had long hoped to see a common school introduced into America, a school that all students, native-born and immigrant, would attend together. This school, accessible to all, would help give Americans a common language and purpose. Education, he wrote in one of his annual reports, beyond all other devices of human origin, is a great equalizer of the conditions of men. But drawing the masses of the foreign and native uneducated into America's current multi-age classrooms was a daunting task. Multi-age classrooms required huge resources and scores of talented, energetic, and flexible teachers. The Prussian system, complete with compulsory attendance, not at that time in American practice, struck man as the perfect answer, the very best way to channel a large number of diverse students into a single institution with a maximum efficiency. With minimal training and a set of curriculum, one teacher could corral and indoctrinate dozens of students at a time, as long as they were of roughly the same age and ability. With man's support, the Prussian system was introduced to Massachusetts in 1847, when the Quincy Grammar School was built with 12 separate classrooms, each room for a single age-graded class, led by a single teacher. The new plan did indeed turn out to be highly efficient, factories generally are, and age-graded schools were soon spreading into the rest of New England's urban centers, westward to other cities, and then out into rural areas as well. By the turn of the century, age grading was the norm in almost all of the nation's common schools. Compulsory attendance laws, also modeled after the Prussian system, followed shortly after. Massachusetts again led the way, passing the first regulations in 1852. So our strong identification of age with grade is the result of, in the words of Rick Hess, our peculiar devotion to a model that defeated Prussian leaders developed in order to salvage the last vestiges of their shattered national pride. Yet it continues to govern all of our ideas about when children learn. 6-year-olds should be capable of first grade work, 14-year-olds of high school work, regardless of individual maturity. So here's our first task. Try to put aside your Prussianized assumptions about grade level and ask yourself, does my child belong in another grade? So Bauer then goes on to not be a fan of shifting students upwards or downwards in grade necessarily, because there are obviously complex issues at work there, right? Like intellectual maturity not matching physical maturity or emotional maturity. So what then do we do? So we recognize that there's a problem, right? That maybe this thing that we're working with wasn't really founded on educational philosophy at all. And I think the classical Christian education movement has been very good at asking questions about why we educate in certain ways. But I do think that perhaps this is an area that we've failed to question for some reason. And so in keeping with my personality and Susan Wise Bauer's book, I'd like to walk through a series of questions together today in an effort to address some of those things. So these mismatches between school and student are what are creating the challenges that we're here to address. So first of all, I want to ask the question, how does a classical Christian philosophy of education affect or inform our view of students with special needs? And by special needs, I mean both those who have a disability and those who are academically gifted. I personally see those both as needs, so I'd like to redefine the term a little bit. The second question is a little bit more pragmatic. What strategies can we employ to pursue the same goals of classical Christian education for all students? And then third, how can the parent-teacher partnership be leveraged in order to help students with special needs thrive in the classical classroom? And then finally, I hope we'll have an opportunity to dialogue a little bit together for any of you to share creative ideas that you are aware of or those that might already be implemented in your schools that could be an effort to bring some effective solutions to this problem. So first of all, how does a classical Christian philosophy of education affect our view of educating students with special needs? Well, I think that the best place to start with this, since we are coming from a Christian worldview, is to ask, who is God and who are we, and what does that have to do with what we're doing here? It's a question that I try to allow to inform what I do in my classroom, whether I'm teaching writing or TESOL or classical education or whatever it may be, or even with my own children who are in the K-12 system currently. So from a Christian standpoint, I think that's where we need to start. And this is largely what sets us apart from the public model of American education, obviously. So our view of who God is, He is the creator God of truth, of beauty, of goodness, of order, and of creativity. And this is something that we celebrate in classical education. I don't have to tell you that. He is also a God who can be known. He's a God who is 3 in 1. He is unified community. I think there's maybe a rabbit trail to chase there on why it's important for us to include all types of learners in the Christian community. And just as another side note, there are lots of rabbit trails we can chase with this topic. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all of them. As far as who we are, human beings have intrinsic value and dignity. We talk about the Imago Dei. We are made in the image of God. Because of that, we can know truth. In fact, we can know God Himself, the ultimate source of truth. Human beings reflect the image of our Creator God by creating. And human beings were made to thrive in relationships, in community. We can see this in the biblical framework for marriage, for family, for friendship, for the local church. It's throughout Scripture. So this is our view of who God is and who we are. And I believe that that should inform how we educate human beings. We have to take these things into consideration. And not just how we educate the middle performing human being, but how we educate all of them well. So the goal of classical education and what sets it apart from progressive American public education is that our goal is the cultivation of human beings. Classical education is formative in nature. We are not merely looking to achieve pragmatic skill production, nor are we simply interested in economic preservation by teaching people skills that will then one day lead to a profession. Classical education is about more than that. We are shaping human beings. We are creating the foundation for our democracy in America. Our founding fathers believed that if we didn't have an educated public, that democracy would fail. So we are doing so much more than just teaching pragmatic skills and creating producers who will then go on to be employed in our society. Sharyl Swope, in this book, Simply Classical, which is an excellent resource and really a forerunner in the work on educating children with disabilities in the classical method. She is quoted as saying, "The formative nature of classical education distinguishes it from much of education today. No matter the skill to be taught in classical education, the formation of the child's mind and character transcends the skill." I think that's an excellent thing to keep in mind about how our educational philosophy should inform how we teach all students. Also, there is the emphasis in the classical philosophy on the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness. I don't think it takes much effort to see how that transcends what most of public education would hold as priority. We don't often see that pointing to absolute truth, the cultivation and appreciation for beauty, and certainly not the moral education that's included, the cultivation of virtue for all children, and the cultivation of wonder and worship, which is so important and so really special to what classical education can bring to the classroom. So, if we can agree upon these things that should inform our view of how to educate all students well, that still doesn't really bring us down to the ground of what does this look like in the classroom, right? I'm sure that we can all agree we want to pursue academic excellence, we want to educate classically, but look at my classroom and I have all these different students. Or as a parent, look at my children. They are on total opposite ends of the spectrum. That's me. So what strategies can we employ to pursue the same goals of classical education for all students? Then the first handout that I've given you is is filled with some notes from Rethinking School. And I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about this theme of mismatches that Susan Wise Bauer addresses. Because that's really what we're dealing with, right? We either have a mismatch in intellectual maturity or social maturity. There is some asynchronous problem with the gifted children. There is some developmental delay with children with disabilities, and it doesn't fit our current model. So what do we do with that? Well, first we need to figure out what the problem is. And I highly recommend this book as a resource for you to recommend to parents, because it gives a lot of suggestions on how to identify what the mismatch is that you're experiencing. Maybe parents or teachers just recognize a few symptoms, but they don't know what the underlying problem is. Obviously, if we can get at the root of the problem, we have a much better chance of finding a cure. So that is certainly the first matter at hand. She has 2 chapters in this book that address both ends of the spectrum of special needs. The first is called disorder, disability, or difference, and I think it's important for us to be able to differentiate between those in order to get students the help that they need. Some of your students may in fact have a disorder. This is a medically diagnosable condition, but it can significantly affect learning. I've listed some examples there. Disabilities and differences are much trickier to differentiate between. There has been a tendency to perhaps overgeneralize learning disabilities. Some estimates say as many as 1 in 5 students exhibit a learning disability. But I think it's curious, as Susan Wise Bauer notes, that the numbers are much higher for elementary school age boys, for example, who might not fit into the mold of sitting quietly in a classroom for 8 hours a day without any exercise or physical activity. The numbers are higher probably because of students who are not primarily propositional thinkers. They might have a more abstract way of looking at the world. They have different kinds of intelligence than that of which is measured on a standardized test. So we have to kind of treat these with some care as we try to figure out what the underlying case is. I've given a few examples there. Many of those I know are present in our school currently, more than even just what's listed there, and I'm sure you could also offer some of these that are present in your educational communities. I've quoted Susan Bauer there. She says in almost every case, the therapy involved for learning disabilities is essentially teach in a different way, teach skills explicitly, target the area where the student needs more work and support. Technically, that's not treatment, it's just good teaching. I hope some of you, and I've seen some of your faces that were in Mary Kay Yank's session yesterday on learning strategies for different types of learners. She gave a lot of practical suggestions on how you can implement that in your classroom. If you weren't there, I think it would be worth reviewing the video of that or getting her handouts that offer some resources on different strategies you can try. But I like that Susan Bauer doesn't stop there. If you see the next part of the quote, yet no matter how gifted the teacher, it is practically impossible to offer this kind of teaching to a large, understaffed classroom of widely differing learners, particularly in a school where the curriculum is inflexible, test-centered, and or tied to strictly defined outcomes at specific grade levels. We could probably just take that quote and spend time talking about smaller class sizes, having support staff, for some of the challenges, maybe rethinking our test model, thinking about the outcomes we tie to specific grade levels, and where there's room for flexibility or creativity within that. But we won't because there's not enough time. So. She also talks about academic giftedness, and in my very limited research, there is so much less out there on how to educate these students than there is for students with learning disabilities. So much less. It's shocking, and especially within the Christian framework. I was looking along the lines of looking for theology of exceptionality. What are we dealing with as far as how we should be dealing with that as the church or as Christians? I found one quality article. So I think I found my next writing project. So academic giftedness. First of all, giftedness is always asynchronous, so different abilities at different rates. That doesn't fit well within our current K-12 model. That by very definition, we're talking about a child who is ahead over here, but not necessarily over here. You may have even heard the terminology twice exceptional. There's even a group within the gifted unit, or community rather, which may exhibit a high level of intellectual ability in a certain area, but then actually struggles as a result of a learning disability or a social problem or an emotional disorder. So just because a child has a high intellectual capacity in one area, not only does that not make it easier for them by definition, it might actually make it harder in some instances. So those students need to be considered as those who have special needs as well. Giftedness can mimic a learning disability. The boredom, restlessness, uncooperative, inattentive nature of some students. We might initially think that would be the result of a disability. It might actually be because of an exceptionality. Giftedness can mask a learning disability for that reason. These students often can cover up and make it through, but I'm not sure that's what any of us are shooting for here, just making it through, right? The goal is not survival, it's thriving educationally. And then giftedness lends itself to perfectionism, which can stall learning. So we also have to be careful with that attribute of gifted children when we're thinking about practical suggestions. Some of the ones that Susan Wise Bauer suggests are, first of all, that we evaluate the benefits and pitfalls of achievement testing. I'm sure all of our schools probably do that differently. I know we've gotten letters before when our daughters have done standardized testing here at SFO explaining that their grades may be lower in some areas because it doesn't fit the model by which we are pushing them through. And I think that's wonderful that we can say that this test is helpful in some regards. Its effectiveness or its accuracy might even change over time as they move through the classical model. But right now, here are the things we care about, and these things, quite frankly, we don't at this point. We need to be able to say that about standardized testing, achievement testing, that is. Secondly, if time spent on homework becomes unreasonable, address the problem. I don't think I need to spend a whole lot of time on this. I'm sure you've all read the bountiful articles and research there is on homework and how kids don't need to be doing it from the time they get home until the time they go to sleep, and how that can actually be detrimental, especially defeating or even embarrassing, humiliating for those students who can't keep up. And then for those who are on the other end of the extreme, it might just be boring or not very effective. I think the goal there is to use the class time to educate and offer time for creative thought and expression outside of school hours. The third one might be new to you or might push you a little bit. Consider single subject acceleration. We know that giftedness is asynchronous, so it probably will not manifest itself across all subject areas. So just simply pushing a child up a grade doesn't solve the problem, right? I mean, that would be logically not really a solution. So what is keeping us from allowing children who are way ahead in one subject area from moving ahead in that area? What do you think some of the roadblocks would be to that?
Well, you would have to specifically teach that one child separately from the rest of the class. Because you can't say, well, like I have kindergarten, I can't go, well, here's some second grade material which you can read, so go read while I teach these kids how to read. You can't do that. Mm-hmm. And so that would be a real big pitfall of that.
Sure, the time of the teacher, absolutely, yeah. What are some other roadblocks you can think of?
When you get to the upper grades, if they're ahead in, say, algebra and they're ready for geometry, they've worked on it during the summer, those times overlap with when they would actually have a class.
Okay.
So then it takes them out of another class that maybe they aren't gifted in.
Okay, so maybe limited time frame blocks for classes, scheduling. Okay. Well, I would suggest that those are both areas that can be overcome. I think we can probably find creative strategies to be flexible with our scheduling. And I think that the next point that I'm going to get to about parent involvement is one way to solve the problem with overworking a teacher trying to meet these special needs of students. We have a unique asset in classical Christian education of the emphasis on the role of the parent and parents' involvement. I've seen it work in my family. I've seen it work in other families where, yes, it does require, there's no getting rid of the fact that it does take extra energy and creativity on part of the teacher to help meet those needs. But I'm not sure that it's an expectation that's unwarranted when a teacher is working with a parent in order to accomplish those goals. Parents obviously approaching a teacher with an idea is much more helpful than the teacher having to come up with all the ideas on his or her own. Yeah. Okay, so single subject acceleration is an option. And then finally, shift the method. Create, pursue projects and activities which appeal to multiple intelligences. Consider alternative assignments for students with disability or exceptionality. And I've included a few pages. I just really couldn't do much better than what Susan Wise Bauer did in her book, so I just decided to give it to you. This is from one of the chapters called Shift the Method. Excuse me, there are, from the right side of the first page to the left side of the last page, sample projects designed for multiple intelligences. I think, just as an observer, and having homeschooled for a couple of years in the classical style and having had children in the school for, I guess, 3 years now or so, there is a tendency, for some reason, for a classical curriculum to be a little bit rigid, a little bit prescriptive, and I don't know if it's because the resurgence is new and so everyone wants to cling to something concrete to make sure they're doing it right, or what the real problem is there. But I mean, the other side of that coin is that we live in a Pinterest world where we've forgotten how to create our own ideas and we just want to find someone else's as well, right? So I think there's room for some creativity there in the classical educational community as far as looking for other ways to achieve our goals. That doesn't mean that we derail the trivium, that we derail the progression that is classical in nature. But it does mean that there are multiple ways to address each of those goals within the classroom, within each grade level, and that there are different strengths and weaknesses in your students. And so, whereas you might not see their intelligence shine on the current assignment that you're giving, you might see it if you try a different avenue. So I thought that some of her ideas were really creative. I love I'm a writing teacher, so obviously that's what I gravitated towards. I love the choose 20 words. The student should use these words in every possible interaction for the next week. I've actually told my students to do that before in college. Not 20 words, but the words. There are several. I won't read through them because you can all read, but there are lots of creative ideas there. And I think her argument was just that we had this big kind of burst of excitement about multiple intelligences, and then it just kind of dwindled off for some reason, but there really hasn't been any research disproving it to my knowledge. So I'm not sure why we're not integrating it as much in the classroom, other than it just does take that extra energy and creativity that we've mentioned. It can be problematic for teachers. Okay, so I've also included in your packet there a couple of other handouts. The next one is on helping academically gifted children thrive. The first quote that I've included there comes from the single article that I was able to find on a biblical ethics for this issue. And it says, "Gifted students certainly present a unique set of challenges to the classroom teacher, but they generally do not require extra or different interventions in order to pass high-stakes assessments. With the current focus on students with learning, emotional, or behavioral disabilities that hinder academic achievement, classroom teachers may spend less time developing differentiated instruction for gifted students than they spend for students with disabilities. In such circumstances, gifted students often find themselves grouped with the middle in classrooms, and there they wait for their peers to catch up, for their teachers to provide challenging content, and for their schools to address their unique needs." I just thought that was a pretty poignant explanation of the problem. I also really appreciated this definition of giftedness by Sally Borink. She is a homeschooling mom. She was an educator. She had a child who is twice exceptional, and so ended up going the homeschooling route. But there are actually a lot of very helpful articles on her website, her blog, if you're interested in further reading, about specifically educating these children from a Christian perspective, which I find really beneficial because there's such a lack of that dialogue going on in the Christian community. So she quotes a definition and then gives her kind of further explanation here. Giftedness is asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awareness that are qualitatively different from the norm. This asynchrony increases with higher intellectual capacity. The uniqueness of the gifted renders them particularly vulnerable and requires modifications in parenting, teaching, and counseling in order for them to develop optimally. There are many children who have advanced cognitive abilities but do not have the heightened intensity. Those are smart kids who do well academically and achieve much in a traditional school setting. Those smart kids are not dealing with the heightened intensity, emotional, sensual, psychomotor, intellectual, and/or imaginational, that complicates the learning experiences of gifted children. Gifted children are those who are simply wired differently than other children. Not better and not worse, but differently, intensely differently. Gifted does not mean automatic success and an easier road in school. It often means just the opposite, as many gifted children do not function well in a classroom environment, and their areas of heightened intensity hinder their ability to perform in academically desirable ways. They truly require modifications in parenting and learning. So if we can agree on that they truly require modifications, which most of us would agree are necessary for those with learning disabilities, what are we doing to modify anything for these gifted students in the classroom? I've offered some helpful resources for families and educators. Some of you may already be familiar with these, but if you're not, they might be an asset. Mensa is an organization strategically helping gifted youth. They have a couple of free programs. This is something you can tell parents about, so this is an opportunity for you to hand it off to the parent. There are free reading programs with incentives. The kids can earn a free t-shirt or something like that, you know. Who doesn't want something free for reading, right? There's also lesson plans for summer or after school projects. Encourage your parents with gifted kids to keep learning at home. I had a relative give my kids a subscription gift this year for Christmas, where one of them gets an engineering box every month of a project to build, and the other one gets something artistic to build. So there are ways outside of the classroom to continue that learning. After schooling has become a thing with parents of gifted children. Continuing a subject of interest to them after school, help equip those parents. They may not be natural educators. I'm an educator by profession. It comes more easily to me than it might the average parent. But that doesn't mean that the parent can't take agency over that and help students in that situation. Hoagie's Gifted is another big website with resources, articles, books, links, and I would mention that this website actually has a specific page for educators, for ideas, for real concrete, pragmatic things to implement in your classroom for these students. And then I've just listed some helpful books. You'll notice that they're not all academic in nature, because some of the issues with gifted children are not purely related to their academic performance. Sometimes it's emotional, social, just that intensity that we're trying to deal with. So some of those might be helpful either for you to read or for you to recommend to parents of those gifted children. So switching gears then, also we need to think about the children with the learning disabilities, differences, and disorders. Okay. Sharyl Swope is my biggest resource for this, because she's the only person I know who's really been diving into what it looks like to classically educate these students. If you read her book, she actually classically educated children with severe disabilities who were not capable of functioning in a regular school environment. But I don't think that negates the helpfulness of many of her strategies for those of us who are in the classroom. I love that she comes from the standpoint of, here is our goal. Here are all these kinds of children. There's a different path for all of them to get to that goal. So she says the special needs child's humanity, any child's humanity, must determine the education he receives. I absolutely affirm that. That's why we started by asking the question, how does our philosophy of education inform the way we treat these children? We need to know why we're doing it, and that helps give us some confidence in the direction we're going. She says, classical education can address any child's challenges and cultivate in him a lifelong appreciation for lasting truth, beauty, and goodness. Modifications can help with behavioral and neurological difficulties, language and sensory challenges, specific learning disabilities, and even severe mental illnesses. Be encouraged. Any educable child can receive these great benefits of classical education: greater self-knowledge, timeless tools for learning, a more disciplined mind, a love of study, and a dedicated life of service. Classical education is a beautiful gift to your child, so he can say with Helen Keller, "My world lies upward, the length and the breadth and the sweep of the heavens are mine." I can't think of any child that we wouldn't want to be able to say that. So what does that look like for children with learning disabilities, differences, disorders? Obviously, there are some modifications that need to be made, right? We tend to be uncomfortable with differentiation of any kind as Americans. It kind of goes against our desire for equality and egalitarianism, right? We don't like it. There's something in us that just quite frankly resists it. And that's something we're going to have to get over in this dialogue to help both ends of children on this spectrum of special needs, because they have special needs. So if we value them as part of our educational community, if we have the same goals for them as every other child, we have to acknowledge that there are differences in our learners. And yes, we look for ways to do that discreetly sometimes. We look for ways to do that without offense to other students and families, but it does not mean that we stop looking to make differentiation. So modifications for the gifted, and now modifications for those with disabilities. Sharyl Swope, I won't read through all of these because I want us to have some time to discuss, but she offers some modifications that I think are helpful because they are targeted at certain age groups. Many of them are very practical. A few that stuck out to me were the ones that help with social behavior. I was just talking to someone at the little mingling thing before we came over about how in the upper school, some of these students who might not be as socially aware or adept, or even those twice exceptional students who struggle in certain situations, someone has to tell them the expected behaviors in a very straightforward, explicit way. Social stories can help with that. I also thought some of the organizational strategies, resources for organizational strategies were helpful. I loved the suggestion to spend a summer with Minimus, the mouse. I don't know, are any of you familiar with Minimus, the mouse? Okay, for elementary school students. It's a Latin curriculum that's really fun, and you can have students use that. There are some different modifications for penmanship challenges, making accommodations like the kind of paper that's used, or basically majoring on the majors. And that's what Mary Kay talked about yesterday, is what are the big rocks for each grade level? You know, what are the big things that you're wanting them to achieve? And then where is there room for flexibility? What is it you're measuring with the test you're giving? Are you measuring content? Then can it be done orally or written? If you're just measuring the content, and save the writing for the writing assessment for children who are struggling with dyslexia or dysgraphia. Where is there flexibility? And only you as a teacher can determine where that is really. And hopefully parents will approach you with those needs. I did also include in here, at the end of Sharyl Swope's book, Simply Classical, there are several true stories of students with disabilities or differences who were classically educated. Some of them are homeschooled, many of them are not. So again, I'd like to emphasize the fact that this is not only achievable when you take the child out of the school. This is attainable in our classrooms. So here is an example of a 12-year-old with Asperger's syndrome, which I know we no longer diagnose that way. We would call this child a high-functioning autistic child. And it's on the front and the back there. And this was within a classical Christian school context. Some of the accommodations that were made to help this child thrive. I would also encourage you to read Sharyl Swope's own testimony of her children who had significant struggles. Multiple. I mean, most people would look at these kids and say the best we can do is teach them how to buy their own groceries one day. That's the best we can do. And she has given them a beautiful education, and they have thrived as adults, and they have skills and self-awareness and abilities that are unbelievable. Even her doctors that she took her children to were baffled at how they achieved so much through classical education. So I really do believe that it's formative, and I really do believe it's formative for all kinds of children. So the question then becomes, what questions do we need to ask? Maybe is that redundant to say the question is the question? We need creative strategies and solutions, and I apologize if you came to this session hoping that you were going to leave with the one solution. I don't have that to offer. But I do think that there are a lot of ways that we can partner with parents to meet specific child needs without putting too much stress on the teacher. Sometimes the parent will come to you. Sometimes you have to go to the parent. They aren't always as aware of an exceptionality or a problem with their children. I think there are ways we can flex the system a little bit, question why we're doing it this way. Is there a better way? Does anybody have any ideas? Let's talk about those ideas. Let's analyze them. Let's critique them. But by all means, let's be open to them at the very least. One of the things I really loved, obviously there were lots of things, right, I really loved about Rethinking School. In this book, Susan Bauer includes 4 thought experiments for parents and children. These are opportunities for you to step back and ask some questions that the end goal is to produce a strategy, but it's to encourage you to just step back for a minute and think about your goals, about your priorities, about your role, some of these big picture things. 2 of them that I thought were really helpful, that I wonder if it wouldn't be helpful for us to ask parents to consider this on a yearly basis, or especially teachers. One was to write 6 to 10 descriptive words that have nothing to do with skills and earning ability, and everything to do with the person you want your child or student to become. How would that shape the way that we educate? Another one was to jot down 2 or 3 alternatives that would work for your family and your children, this is targeting the parents, to replace the school's role in the following: child minding, recreation and exercise, job preparation, developing mental and emotional health, person-to-person socialization, and cultural socialization. So where are we as a school not allowing the parent to take agency in certain areas or equipping them to do that? How can we encourage parents to do that? Not all of them are naturally going to hold on to that like I do. I still view myself as my kids' primary educator. I delegate some of their day to their teachers. Not everybody views it that way, especially people who aren't familiar with the classical model. So what can we do? Thought experiments. What can we incorporate into the orientation at the beginning of the year? How can we tell parents, how can we give them resources? How can we do this better in order to partner with parents to educate all these types of students well? And then finally, as I mentioned, just keep questioning. What are some of the aspects of the model, the K-12 model, that we in the classical Christian community have failed to address so far, that we're just taking from what used to be or what's always been or what's been passed down from generation to generation? We've done an excellent job of questioning some of the underlying premises in public education. We haven't fully exhausted it, right? There's still some things to be questioned, to ask why, We encourage our students to do that. It's time that we not stop doing that ourselves, right? So I'd like to end. I'm not sure, Kyle, how much time do we have? Like 10 or 15 minutes? Or
5.
Oh, 5. Okay, well. Are there things that your school has done to challenge that K-12 age grade very set model? Do any of you come from schools where you've tried a pilot program or you've done something differently? Would you please share?
It's not necessarily something huge, but
Okay.
you mentioned the single subject acceleration. We do that in math.
You do that in math,
Allow
okay.
it in others, but math is typically, I can think of about 3 boys who are actually gifted and they struggle, in other areas, but math is their thing, and we allow them to go to the other class and they're taught by another teacher.
Okay,
Let's
so
say
they
he's
actually
second grade,
leave your
he's in fourth
classroom.
grade, and he's being taught by the 4th grade teacher along with the 4th graders.
Okay.
And then he comes back to his, but I do see how scheduling, we have, our
Sure.
schedule is pretty straightforward for the primary school, so they all have the same subjects at the same time, so that helps.
Okay. But that does eliminate some of the burden of the teacher in the classroom with that child, the homeroom teacher.
Another teacher who is 4th grade teacher
Yeah.
or 7th grade teacher.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do that too. Before the students come into the school, they do a placement test for both the reading and the math. And then we're a K through, we go through 8th grade, but up until 5th grade, everybody's doing the same subject at the same time. And so they're able to either move up or move down depending on their ability. After we do that placement test, we have a partnership conference with the parents, and we talk with them about where you feel your child needs to be, how much. We're a university model school too, where the kids come to school 2 days
Sure.
a week, and then they're homeschooled on the other days.
I've done that too. We've done all kinds at our house.
That works. That
Yeah.
has worked really, really well.
That's interesting.
Truly is partnering with the parents. Which when I was teaching in a 5-day-a-week school, I thought was just really weird. Now I see the benefit of it and the blessing of it, and the fact that you're giving more time back to the parents to really pour into their children's lives.
So it's interesting you have a conference with them after that testing and placement before. So I can see how that would even further facilitate that parent guidance into. Yeah.
It's their choice then. If they want to put their child in the level where it's going to be a huge struggle with them, then they're going to have to deal with those struggles at home. Or if they're willing to give them a challenge, then they can challenge at home too.
Interesting. Any others who are implementing strategies? Well, does anyone have ideas to share? Maybe they aren't implemented yet, but
I was just going to say that it's easier for us to hand out an assignment to every student and say, write a paragraph about whatever. And so it's harder on the teachers, but if we leveled that, you can, you don't want to do it every day. You may not want different age groups and kids to know you're even doing it. But 4 students write a paragraph, it's more student to their learning. 4 students draw a picture, 4 students do that. And then they can share in front of the class, and you're leveling it in a way that's catered to them, but they don't even know it.
absolutely. You know, I can just tell a personal story. Yesterday, I sat through Mary Kay's session, and she was talking about the read alouds that she does and how it's improved reading fluency for her students. I've had 2 of my children have Mary Kay as a teacher. I never knew that some of the reading passages were harder until yesterday. So I can assure you that the students don't know. She mentioned that she copies different sections and sends them home with different students to practice at home. I never knew that my kids were coming home with a harder reading assignment than the others. So that speaks very highly to her interest in addressing some of those emotional responses to differentiation, which are real, right? I mean, certainly we have an obligation as teachers to try to be discreet when it's necessary, but at the same time to not give up, the differentiation just because we're trying to make everyone feel like they're doing the same thing. So I thought that was a real testimony to her effectiveness in doing that. Yes.
I think this would probably be a whole nother topic, which we don't have
I think we
for,
could
but
probably have 4 or 5 more sessions on this topic. Yeah.
I wish we had time to explore the ideas of it's definitely a smaller population than, I would say, the community of parents engaging the parents, but I think there's also a part of the spectrum where parents think their child is struggling with something because they only see them at home and they never come to the classroom to see them shine. So they are constantly, and our kids are what we tell them they are. And so if a child is going to hear, you have this problem, in a loving way, not meaning any ill harm from the parent at all, but the parent never comes and sees them interacting with that knowledge that they've done at home, that's a disservice as well. And so I think somehow we've got to get the parents to want to come and see that.
And I just realized when you said that I did skip over what I was going to say about parents. I get so excited about it, all the ideas and thinking about how to change it. You know, I think the reason why we can be so effective partnering with parents is because we have that close partnership built into what we say our schools are, whether they're the university model or even a 5-day model. We're emphasizing that from the get-go. We also have the advantage of having a team of knowers about our students. I've come to affectionately call my kids' teachers and some other teachers with whom I've been in contact about my kids' needs. They're my team of knowers, and I include them in with my doctors and therapists and everyone else, but I'm part of that team too, because I know my child intimately. These teachers know my child from an educational standpoint, and they're experts in first grade or second grade or third grade or music or art, whatever the teacher's giftedness is. You know, they're experts in their field, and I'm an expert mom. And so, and I go to an expert doctor and an expert vision doctor and an expert, you know, and all those people together are what's going to help that child thrive. So it's a team of knowers, and ideally, yes.
I just had a question.
Sure.
This is your experience,
yes,
too, and just from the teacher's perspective. Did you ever have a teacher come to you and say, what do I do? You know,
yes,
help me with your child. And how does that affect you then as a parent? Are you like, oh, well, shouldn't you tell me? Or, you know, how does that interaction where the teacher is basically leaning on the parent and wants to...
I have had that happen for my child who is on the lower end of the spectrum. I've never had it happen for my gifted child, which I think is probably indicative of where we tend to lean our resources. I say never. At the parent-teacher conferences, it has been something discussed, but it's never been something, you know, individually addressed to me on that end. And I would say, yes, I do have teachers come and say, what can I do? Anything that you want to try, let's try it. And I've come armed with strategies.